Hello! So firstly, this isn't the sort of normal content you find on my channel. Being Adam Thomas Music, I normally talk about, music, guitars. I do a bit of technology and computing with music, but when I saw this video, I just had to make a video response. This is a video response to a YouTuber I quite like actually, which is Linus Tech Tips. And this is a video response to his video entitled 10 Ways macOS is Just Better.
10 ways that macOS really is just plain better.
Now I've got to say that it's actually the title is one of the biggest things I take issue with, as the title specifically is talking about macOS, the operating system that runs on most Macintosh computers. Now this did go out to the community, so people on Linus Tech Tips, like his forums, Twitter, whatever, but the title of it being what makes macOS better. So it's not what people prefer about Macs, it's not what would make a Mac better, which would be the whole package of the operating system and the computer, although technically the Mac would just be the computer itself, which you could technically run Windows on. But he's specifically talking about Mac OS. So that's my first issue with it. My second issue with it is that some of the points simply don't ring true. Now I know this is, like I said, compiled from the community response, but surely as a very prominent tech YouTuber, if a point is made constantly that doesn't quite ring true, he should call it out. Now, just to prove that I'm not going to be all sour grapes in this, after I've gone through all 10 points of his video and critique them, I'm actually going to do my own list of 10 things that macOS does better than Windows. Let's go on with all 10 of his points.
Number one is a big one. The ecosystem that Apple has created. I mean, the fact that you can have your phone, laptop, desktop, and even a watch, and then have your data, documents, photos, even copy, paste, or open websites just move seamlessly from one to the other via handoff and iCloud is so cool.
So if you're into the whole ecosystem thing, then sure, this is kind of a good point, but this whole point relies on, this relies kind of on hardware more, so this is indeed a macOS thing. And once again, one of the reasons I'm being so specific about macOS, other than the fact that that's what the video title is that you could technically do this on a Hackintosh, for example. But this whole point relies, at least the first part of it, relies entirely on if you own iPads, iPhones. And even then, it's not always great. I've had issues with it, people know I've had issues with it. There's also, for example, while I was at university once, some at this point is slightly out of date, but I'm going to go with it anyway, that we were filming something on an iPhone, and we wanted to get the video off. We couldn't send it because it was too large, so we plugged it into the Macintosh, and it wouldn't accept it unless we paid extra for extra software. Plugged into a Windows PC that was running iTunes, which is free of charge, and it did it. So we almost felt like we were being penalised for being in the ecosystem. It didn't feel particularly, eco-friendly within that term. And also, I've already done 2 videos on my iPod that's had issues with iTunes just sort of deselecting things that would allow it to actually sync music and podcast, the whole point of a standard iPod in the first place. Doesn't really feel like the ecosystem is very nice in that regard. But all in all, if you do use an iPhone all the time and you have it actually set up properly, because I'm willing to believe that the point I made earlier could have been we just didn't have things set up properly, then that's a good point.
Another part of the ecosystem that results in it just works, or it's like magic, is the first-party peripherals. They all just work with little to no initial setup and have the great feel and functionality that almost make them must-haves.
Look at those 4 bits of hardware he described. So, the AirPods, I can't comment on so much, I'll admit. I don't know if people use them really for I guess they would use them for their laptops, which are actually running macOS, but majoritively AirPods seem to be designed to be used for iOS, which is not macOS. This is not advantages to Apple products. This is ways that macOS, the operating system that runs on Macintosh computers, makes it better. So the AirPods I'm going to kind of throw out. The other peripherals, can anyone honestly say that the Magic Keyboard is a good keyboard? I do like, and I will bring this up, I do like the fact that, I don't know if they've gotten rid of it recently, but that it does have an eject button on it if you're using an optical drive. That's a quite nice feature. But other than that, the keyboards are not very good. They're sort of chiclet, they're unresponsive, I don't like the shape of them. They're not very nice. That's also subjective, and I will completely agree that what I'm saying here is subjective. But I think that once you're getting to subjective points, that's hard to argue that it's better because you're just saying I prefer this versus I prefer this. But then it goes on to say how they just work. Well, of course they do. When was the last time you had a like a Windows PC that you can just plug a standard keyboard into and work? And if you're talking about first party, Microsoft's keyboard, especially Microsoft's mice, are actually really nice. I've been using a Windows PC since Windows 98, and I don't think I've ever had a problem with just plugging in the keyboard and it just working. And the same with a mouse. Apart from, the wireless mice, most of the time you can plug them in and actually use them rather than have to plug it in from the underneath. The trackpad point he then goes on and makes is pretty valid. For the laptops, they do have really, really good trackpads, and a lot of people sort of copy their design now. But once again, that's getting onto hardware. That's not talking about Mac OS.
Finally, we can't forget about AirDrop, Apple's wireless file beaming solution that sort of makes up for the inability to get certain files off an iPhone over USB.
As I said earlier, even though I've had a bad time with it, if it's improved now, then AirDrop is a good idea. I'll give them that.
Number 2, easy navigation and organization. Mission Control, Apple's visual app manager, lets you see what you have open as well as create virtual desktops.
Organization functionality. That's once again a very subjective one, and subjectively to my view, I find it to be one of the most difficult and unnecessarily awkward operating systems to run. Although the whole mission control screen is quite a nice feature, and I think I feel like it's there as a necessity to clear up the other issues it has. If you're just talking about why macOS is just better, which is the title, 10 Reasons Why macOS is Just Better, doesn't specify better than Windows, I would argue that the GNOME desktop environment, which is used on Linux systems, does this whole feature much better. I think once again, being subjective here, I think that it takes the sort of design of how macOS is meant to run and actually does it well. So the whole virtual desktop part and everything there, once again, GNOME does this, but so does Windows. So here's the thing. You can have, and this is where I was imagining this video is going to go more. You can have a feature that macOS and Windows both have, but if you can argue the case for why the macOS version of it is better, then you have a point to argue here. But simply just to claim that, it has workspaces. So does Windows. You've not made the point that it is better. You've just said it exists. If it existed and was really useful and didn't in Windows, then yes, that would be a better feature. That would be something that would make macOS better. But it has something that Windows has, the same thing. And you haven't explained why macOS's version might be better.
Speaking of swiping, Apple's trackpads are freaking amazing. I've said it before, a lot, but Apple has nailed the trackpad in every way. Feel, functionality, and especially the gestures.
Once again, I agree with the trackpads being really good. Once again, this is hardware, not software. And then gestures, I think it's a very subjective one. I mean, sure, maybe its gestures are better than ones in Windows. Personally, I don't like using them, so I never use them in either system. But, I'll be willing to give this one a slide, assuming it works better. Let's move on to part 3.
Number 3 is Spotlight. A quick command spacebar allows you to find just about anything on your Mac or anywhere else. Need directions to the nearest restaurant? Easy. Forgot where you put your master's thesis due Monday? Bam, Spotlight's found it. That recipe is in metric and all your baking supplies are imperial? Poof, converted. It's a great tool and it's ultra fast.
So maybe Spotlight is improved now, but whenever I've used it, it's been nigh on unusable. But actually, the way he shows it in the video seems like it has matured and actually become very functional. I'll give you this one. Let's move on to point 4.
Number 4 is the ready-to-run experience. I mean, there are very few things that an average user would need to install to be able to deal with most work or casual situations.
Now, you almost made me really salty at the beginning of the ready-to-run one, because I hear a lot of people spewing the old Windows 95 argument 20-something years in the future of, you just get it out and it works. When was the last time you went and bought, not built, because that will be different, but you went out and bought a Windows PC and you weren't able to just turn it on as go? Now, some do come with things like, the Microsoft Office suite already installed, some don't. But for the most part, it is set up, the drivers are set up, it's ready to go. This whole thing of, having to spend a whole afternoon installing the system, blah, blah, blah. Like those old rubbish Mac adverts that everyone ended up parodying that use this argument that even by the time that was made was already mostly out of date. Yeah, Windows 10 in particular, especially, you put a new piece of hardware in, the drivers are going to work with it. You haven't specifically said Windows, so the out-of-the-box experience on Linux is possibly even better.
GarageBand, iMovie, and Photos are already included to help your simple creative projects get started. And Apple includes their basic but functional productivity suite for free, while Windows can't even open a PowerPoint until you install separate software.
I will give you the point though that stuff like iMovie and GarageBand are really good features. GarageBand in particular, as there's nothing out of the box on Windows other than third-party pieces of software that'll do a functionality like this. So it is a really useful thing to have.
Another big inclusion is Apple's Preview. It's a PDF viewer, it's an image file converter, it slices, it dices, it even lets you preview video files in Finder and fill out forms and sign them too.
I don't really see what the big case with Finder is. It basically does everything that Windows 10 will already do through slightly different programs. The editing of the pictures is already in there as well. Yeah, I don't really see the point. The point of this seems to be just subjective. I believe you can have objective reasons why it's better, which is part of the reason why, like I said at the end of this video, I'm going to do a list of 10 things that macOS does better than Windows, because there are indeed things it can do, and it has. But simply to just say, oh, the picture viewer we think is nicer, without a huge amount of backing behind the argument, is quite weak.
Number 5 is Boot Camp. Got a Windows laptop and want to run a Mac app? You're plumb out of luck. But on the flip side, every Mac can be a Windows or Linux machine.
Now, this was the point in which you jumped the shark in the video. Want to run a Mac program on a Windows PC? Well, you're plumb out of luck. Linus, you know this to be untrue. Please don't be intellectually dishonest. You've done entire videos on Hackintoshing and virtual machines, everything like that. You know that you can either dual boot into macOS, assuming on your hardware is capable of it, on a Windows PC, or use a virtual machine. Sure, Boot Camp might already be there. Boot Camp is basically what? It's just a bootloader. It just allows you to change between operating systems. Windows can do this. Yeah, so you could just do literally the same thing with a PC. Or, you could dual boot into Linux, because we're not talking about that, and Linux could do the same thing, because Boot Camp is very similar to Grub. So yeah, to make the comparison even of, you can do edits and changes to Grub, which is the most standard Linux bootloader within that operating system, which is, once again, you're saying better arbitrarily, not comparing it to anything else. Sure, the answers you've taken have been from the community, but you know that this point isn't exactly true, and that you wouldn't be plumb out of luck if you wanted to run a piece of Mac software on a Windows PC. You would be able to do it. To say that, oh, it would be somewhat difficult out of the box, potentially, most people do prefer to use something like VirtualBox, but you can use, Hyper-V, I believe, for Windows virtualization, to do the same thing, just with standard Windows. I would hardly call that plumb out of luck. But sure, Boot Camp is quite nice to have. Let's go to the next point.
Number 6 is, it just works, but specifically for developers.
Okay, take what I'm about to say in this point with a grain of salt. Because firstly, I am not a coder, developer, programmer, hacker, anything like that.
That macOS is based on Unix, specifically a highly modified version of BSD. At a very high level, developers and system administrators love Unix because they can dig deep into the OS and have a clear understanding of what's happening. For average users, the benefit is the stability that comes from such a solid foundation.
I imagine that this does make it better than Windows in that case. I would agree in that case. It's always nice to have an open, free and open source code base. Although in macOS it's sort of like a cannibalized version of BSD, so not everything going on in there is open. And seeing as this video doesn't specify to be better than Windows, surely rather than having a system where you can see a chunk of the kernel being open and actually seeing what's going on, but having a load of proprietary, closed down, locked out code on top of it, surely that's going to be more difficult than just using, GNU/Linux, or using a proper BSD system in which everything, or nigh on everything, will be open. So, you can take this point over Windows, but once again, bring you back to the title where you say 10 reasons why macOS is just better. Better than what? You're not specifying that you're saying just better than Windows. This loses out to Linux and to BSD, because they can do a chunk of the point you're saying here better.
Another thing our developer fans brought up is Xcode, Apple's integrated development environment.
Now the other points, like the actual program to run the code and everything, I know nothing about that. So assume it's true. Let's go to the next point.
Number 7, exclusives aren't exclusive to gaming consoles, and macOS has a fair few of its own. Logic Pro has been one of the standards in the music industry for years, alongside Pro Tools, another digital audio workstation, or DAW. Logic Pro is preferred by many professionals because it doesn't rely on third-party vendors to provide core functionality or even music samples.
So here's where my expertise as a musician comes in, and to begin with, I will give you a good old yes, I agree. Some of the first-party programs, like the one big one to talk about here is Logic, yeah, that's a big clincher for a lot of people. That is what will make them buy a Mac, or just use Mac OS if that's what we're supposed to be talking about. It's not without its problems though. Have a look at my video on here, the myth of the Mac musicians, as you can see why you don't necessarily need to use that as a musician, and the fact it does have some glaring issues.
The big one though, of course, is Final Cut Pro. As a video editing suite, it is loved by professionals and amateurs alike.
But you know, it's a good program, and I agree with that, and you know, Final Cut and everything, yes, people love these programs. They would be a good reason to get Mac OS.
Parallels is another exclusive that lets you have much of the functionality of Boot Camp by enabling you to run Windows or Linux without even shutting down your macOS operating system.
But then we get on to Parallels. We get back into this whole virtualizing point. Now, a lot of people like to use stuff like VirtualBox or VMware. So I'm going to assume within your argument so far that we're excluding anything third party. We're talking about out of the box, what you get, not downloading anything else in particular, hence why you brought up Apple's Office suites and everything. You have just said that Parallels exists, and that's why it's better than Windows. Windows has stuff like Hyper-V, Windows has like the Windows virtualization thing. Like, it's not the best system in the world, but it will virtualize another system. You know, you can do this. It is there out of the box. Now, if you'd actually brought up something like Hyper-V and actually spoken and given points about how Parallels is better, then I'd feel much more comfortable with your argument. But once again, you're claiming that the existence of something, when Windows actually has something that can equal it, makes it better. If you have things like that, you've got to argue as to why it's better, rather than just its existence being what makes it better when Windows already has something that can parallel it. No pun intended.
Number 8, accessories. Want to personalize all the stuff you own so you can be your own unique unicorn? Well, you can do that. Because Apple has a smaller, more focused product line, it's easier and in many cases more cost-effective for third parties to support, which leads to a ton of options for consumers.
So this brings up two previous points I've brought up. One, once again, your title speaks about Mac OS. It doesn't matter what, you could run a Macintosh computer with Windows on it, but you could still buy those stickers or those lids to put on your computer. That has to do with hardware. You're talking about Mac OS, which is the operating system, which is an operating system that can also be put, although something of great difficulty, be put onto other computers. Which means at that point, it just has nothing to do. If you had labelled this 10 great things Macs do, something like that, Macs being specified as the computer, then this would be like a fine point. Or this would be a point why a lot of people like using them. But to say this is the thing that makes Mac OS, which is the operating system, better, no. That's not even an argument. I can't see this as a point. I see you as doing 9 points now. Also, we are now bringing in third-party equipment. Your previous points, as in how Windows doesn't have a Office suite built in. Well, I can easily solve that problem at Linux across by using LibreOffice. Done. Don't have a audio editing suite like GarageBand, I can go download one. At that point, you know, the advantages will start to slightly fall apart, especially when we're talking about the out-of-box experience, because if we are going to include third-party like software and hardware in this, then the out-of-box experience thing sort of falls flat, especially when we consider how sort of irritating Apple's Office suite is, especially with compatibility with other standards. I don't know why it doesn't use like the Open Document Standard or DocX just to make it compatible with everyone else, but anyone who has a mate that runs something like Pages knows the struggle of having to get them to convert or resave things differently. It's just such a pain. So yeah, I'm just going to throw out this whole point. Linus, it brings up holes in your other arguments. Once again, I know that this was all points compiled from the community, but if a load of people are saying a point which you don't feel is relevant to the title or sort of makes a hole, you either shouldn't use it or you should bring it up as like an extra, or bring it up as something that was said a lot. You know, let the people speak, but say, you know, this isn't actually anything to do with the operating system, but it's something that's nice about owning a Mac. Or maybe you should have seen when all the people actually gave you your opinions that you should possibly shift the titling slightly so that this makes sense. Because chunks of this would be better, like a lot of this, if you just put it as, you know, 10 reasons why people prefer Macs, or 10 reasons why Macs could be better, something like that. But once again, I'm going to bang on about it. 10 reasons why Mac OS, the operating system, is better, and you're talking about case stickers. Next point.
Number 9 is that Apple products cost more. And believe it or not, I'm actually not joking with you guys. Apple has made a lot of noise in recent years about how the product is the product instead of the customer being the product. But they really do walk the walk for the most part. When's the last time Apple tried to cram their crappy web browser down your throat so they can collect more of your data to sell? When have they served you an ad when you went to launch a program? They haven't.
So this makes them better than Microsoft, and it's a lot better than Google in this scenario with data tracking. So yeah, that's good. If you were to use this as a reason why it's better than Windows, then yes, I'd have to agree. However, once again, it's just why macOS is better. If you care wholeheartedly about your privacy, if that is your big thing, then GNU/Linux. Just a Linux system or BSD or something like that. That's going to be far more private and secure than macOS. But, you know, I do have to praise them. If they aren't collecting loads of data and selling it, then, you know, good guy Apple, good on you. That would be a good point. Last point.
Finally, number 10, reliability. Now this one is sure to spark some debate in the comments, but guys, hear me out for a moment. If your Mac fails, Time Machine is flippin' awesome. You set it up once and you can basically forget about it until you need it, and it's there to get you back up and running lickety-split. Furthermore, Apple's versions feature, which allows access to previous versions of documents and files, makes it an even greater asset to both professionals and average users. Now, we're not glossing over Apple's reliability scandals. There have been quite a few.
Like we alluded to, we have the entire Lewis Rossman channel as pretty much a big counter argument to this, and you know, design faults they've had they haven't gone through. Yeah, I've also once again in my Myth Mac Musician video have explained my issue with the stability issues that Mac has. You know, Windows has it as well, but you know, sometimes I've run, in that video I'll talk about how I believe when I was using Pro Tools, a piece of software that I've used on both macOS and Windows, a similar workload of what I'm using on Windows, in that case was even actually a weaker hardware-wise PC than the Macintosh, and Macintosh had an outright just system crash. So you know, it's not always just better, but yeah, something like Time Machine, the backup features are really good. You can have that one. So Linus, I'd really like to see you do like another video on this. Maybe you could retitle this one to being, you know, what does the community prefer about Macintoshes? And then you could do one of, you know, what do we at Linus Media Group think of it? Because then you can sort of not have points like saying that you're going to be plumb out of luck with virtualizing or dual booting macOS onto a traditional PC that might want Windows, because you know that to be untrue. You have multiple videos demonstrating this, so I don't think you should be making these points. You know, you can, like I said, you can bolster stuff like parallels. You can bolster Boot Camp as being, you know, great, just out of the box in the system features. But to say that Windows just can't do this is not true. So, true to my word, I'm going to give you my top 10 of things that I believe make macOS, the operating system, better than Windows. Because like I said before, if we start bringing stuff like Linux or GNU systems or BSD into this, it'll become a bit of a, like, you know, a multi-way war, and it'll be difficult to get top 10 of any of those really, because, you know, it might be, you know, one operating system might beat another operating system or something, then the third one could beat both of them in that, or just one of them in that, and yeah. You never try and fight a war at multiple fronts, as Nazi Germany learned towards the end of the Second World War. So we're just going to do it on one front. Here are my top 10 things that macOS does better than Windows. One is it does have less viruses. Now, one thing I do want to preface here, especially if you're a Mac user, is please do not have the ignorance and the arrogance to believe that you do not need to have your firewall set up and an antivirus working. And I also push this towards Linux users as well. There is no such thing as an impenetrable fortress. And your operating system, being based on BSD, will help you with security. And the big thing is, and this is the thing that honestly will help Linux as well, is the fact that it's far less popular than Windows. However, you still do get them. So secure yourself, but for the vast majority of cases, you're going to be running a safer system than Windows in the sense of there are far less viruses for it. That is a big plus on its part, and that is one of the reasons why a lot of people do actually change over from running Windows to running something like macOS. Number two is that if we are going to try and talk about just the out-of-the-box experience, so rather than using third-party pieces of software, Safari as a web browser, it is a far less privacy-intrusive browser than Microsoft Edge. The whole point Linus made of Apple, collecting this data. I'm pretty sure in one of Brian Lunduke's videos where he was talking to the creator of the Brave browser, he even might have praised, don't quote me on this because I'm pretty sure I got this right, but I'm pretty sure he praised Safari for actually being a pretty good other browser for privacy. When compared to Edge, we know it sucks up loads of data. It's just like Chrome in that regard. Of course, later on you can install another browser if you want something secure. You got like Firefox, Brave, stuff like that. But for the out-of-the-box browsing experience, it's got one up on Windows in that regard. Now here's something that was never brought up that I really think should be brought up, and I genuinely think, and I do to all these points, that as someone who uses Windows and Linux as my like most common operating systems, there's something that macOS's file manager does that I would love for either or both of those systems to implement. But once again, we're talking specifically about Windows here, so for them. And that's that you have the color coding feature in macOS's file manager where you can like add a dot to different things. I've not used it when I've used macOS, but I just can't help but feel like that would be such a useful feature, because say you use red to describe a certain thing, let's pretend it was me, and red is going to be everything to do with guitars, seeing as my channel's on guitars, right? And blue is everything to do with amps, okay? If I'm looking for a folder or something and I just want to click on it, and it's got both in, for example, I then want to be able to just color code everything between what would be guitar-related things, what would be amplifier-related things. And that's just, you can organize into files, but having the color coding feature in there as well, it's just a really nice point. And I think it's a damn shame that as a really nice feature within the operating system, it wasn't mentioned in the other list, hence why it goes in mine. Next, jumping back onto BSD again, is that it follows the Unix philosophy of security, something that it shares in common with Linux, which is a Unix-like operating system, whereas Mac is a sort of somewhat Unix-based operating system, is that it asks for your password in far more things, especially when it's about to make some sort of system-level change. Now, Windows has had a thing recently where it asks you yes or no, but this requires you to actually type in your password and hit enter to gain root access and stuff like that. And that just makes your whole system that bit more secure. It can seem like a bit of a pain in the butt having to do your password so often, but it does make your system more secure. That is something that it does have above Windows. Here's one I hadn't thought of before, but like what it pointed out to me, is that the little downloads folder on the dock. How useful is it when because normally when you download something, if you haven't got it on auto run, you just want to immediately use it, right? It downloads it, it goes straight into there to be used, and you can easily access stuff. Or say you download something, you want to use it later. Rather than having to open up your file manager to go and find it, you can find it straight from that part in the dock. Now I know that on Windows 10, when you click on the start menu, just above the power on and off button, you have the downloads bit, but it's just not as easily accessible. How great would it be in Windows if there was a button that works for downloads the exact same way that macOS's downloads did on the Docker in the taskbar? That'd be super useful. It's a nice little feature to have. Now, correct me if I'm wrong here, but the only sort of password managing that comes with Windows out of the box, once again, not talking about third party here, is the one it has within Edge. But what if you want your password manager for a program? Mac has, it's called Keychain, I believe. macOS has Keychain, which comes out of the box. People are getting much more into using password managers these days, so it's nice to have one out of the box. As Linus alluded to, Time Machine is just a much, much better backup system than whatever Windows has. Somewhat alluding to the point Linus made about, the more you pay that your machine is the product rather than you, there's far less bloatware in a typical macOS installation than there was a Windows PC. Now sure, this is going to be worse if you get one from a manufacturer, like a HP computer or Lenovo is going to have a load of stuff installed on it, but on a macOS system, you will typically not really have bloatware, unless you count Pages as bloatware because it's not very usable. Mission control is actually a good feature to have, and Windows has stuff somewhat similar to it, but macOS is much better. Personally, I prefer the one that's using GNOME, but when we're comparing it to Windows here, it's a really, really good feature to have. And finally, GarageBand. Now, it's not my preferred system. I like using things like Pro Tools, but for the majority of cases, Windows will have something that can compete with what macOS comes out of the box. For example, if you have, Windows has like the Movie Maker, I think it has a new version of that now, it's actually meant to be really good. I haven't tried it yet, versus like iMovie with Macs. So, you have like a basic video editor versus another basic video editor. But like I said, Windows doesn't really have anything like GarageBand. It's actually, and especially coming back to my whole case, this is normally a music channel, that is a great feature to have out of the box. Those are my top 10 things that can make macOS a better operating system than Windows out of the box. So there you have it. They're all my 10 picks and sort of my talking down of Linus's 10 picks. I'd love to hear, if he ever sees this, what Linus would think of this video. I just think that parts of it just didn't need to have been said, or could have been said differently, as they weren't quite true. My normal music-based content will continue from my next video onwards, and if you enjoyed, please like and subscribe. Goodbye.